Hello, I'm John Peters, and today we're going to review another book with Graham Sclater, a UK author and music publisher, and also a scriptwriter. Good evening, Graham.
Good evening, JP. Nice to be with you.
Yes, and you too. It's that time of the month again. It's March Book Review, isn't it?
Yes, it is. March Book Review. Great book tonight.
Oh, fantastic, I tell you.
Well, I know, because you're from the East End.
I'm from the East End, yes.
And this is called My East End by Gilda O'Neill. Unfortunately, she passed away a year or so ago, and this was her first book. It's not a brand new book. I was drawn to it by the title, My East End, because I'm working on another novel as well as the one I'm currently on, which is set partially in the East End at wartime. And so I thought, well, you know, she's obviously writing about a time that she knows well about. She's lived there. And I thought, well, if I get some little snippets of information that would sit well within my novel, then so much the better.
Yes, that's great. Well, even her nan, this is the best bit I love, her nan owned a pie and mash shop.
Yes, I know. And of course, jellied eels, pie and mash, I mean, they're still around, and you see most of them. There's stores on a Sunday now in London, but not as they used to be, and it's a very sad thing, really, isn't it, JP?
Yes, a lot of the stalls have gone from outside pubs in London and one thing and another. I do know of a pie and mash shop which I go to whenever I go down to London, which is not far from where I used to live, actually, in Walthamstow, down the Walthamstow Market. Yes, always down there. Yes, I head for that.
It's nice. I mean, what surprised me with this book, when I started, I was amazed at the information she put in, because the book doesn't start in the era when she was born. She's born in 1953. It doesn't start then. The actual book, she actually tells you how London came to be where it is. And the Romans decided to use London as the focal point, but prior to that, Colchester was if you like, the centre of the universe as far as England was concerned.
That's it. Very interesting, yes.
And what happened was they moved into London, Londinium as they called it, but they were only there a few years, which surprised me. I thought they were there for years and years, but they weren't. They set it up, and then because of the other problems they had around the world, they decided to almost decamp and move out of England. Of course, they set a lot of things up in London, but the story, it goes right back to almost the beginning, when the Thames was wide and shallow, with lots of sandbanks and islands in the middle of it, where people used to live. And a lot of the things that in the 1700s, 1800s almost mirror things that are happening today with immigrants, violence and things like that, and how the East End, as it was when it started, evolved. It used to be one of the richest areas in London.
Yes, it did.
Because the ships used to come in, and then, of course, it gradually ended up in disrepair. I mean, there's one bit in it which I had to read twice. She said some of the people were so poor, there were 5 families living in one room. That's one room, not a house or floor, one room. And I read it again, and I thought, that's a mistake. 'Cause I always look for mistakes in other people's books. I thought, that's a mistake. And I read it again, and then I continued to read, and it said, one family in each corner and one in the middle. Ooh. Now, you imagine that, 5 families, and the room's much smaller then than they are now. So if you take the average lounge or sitting room or whatever you want to call it, and you try to put one family living in it, leave alone 5.
Well, when my father lived in the East End, he was one of 11, and they had 2 bedrooms. So you can imagine there, and I mean, families were bigger in them days, much bigger. Yeah,
well, my mother was one of 11 down here in Devon, and she had the same problem. You know, they literally, because my wife's done the research, and they lived on one floor of the house. But having been in one of these, because there are a few left now in Exeter that they've renovated, and there's not enough room to swing a cat in a room. So to live, 5, 6 families living in one house, no toilet, no running water.
No.
Disease was rife.
Yeah, toilets were outside, weren't they?
Well, that's right. But I mean, parts of London, they called it the big smell of London. And all the effluent went into the Thames. Of course, they used to slaughter animals and throw the offal into the Thames. I mean, Thames was a dumping ground, and it became so bad that the MP sitting at Westminster at the Houses of Parliament actually couldn't convene because the smell was so bad. But the East End, some of the places there, of course, were downwind, so they didn't actually get to smell it.
Very true.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing, Whitechapel it's a lovely area now, but that was the pits, really. John Merrick, who many people know as Elephant Man, was one of the people that lived there, and they had an area where literally all the deformed people were based. Other people from other parts of London used to go and see them. In Whitechapel, of course, you had the murders, Jack the Ripper and things like that. I mean, you couldn't go there in those days. I mean, it was so rife with violence and everything else that it was an incredible thing.
Yeah, there's one thing actually, reading in little bits and pieces about it. Bethnal Green. Bethnal Green, I remember when I was a lad when I was being brought up. You go through Bethnal Green, and you used to be, I don't know where it is, soap powder manufacturer.
That's right.
And
That was massive. Yeah,
you can smell that as you went through the area, and it always reminded me of soap powder every time I went through there.
Yeah, well, of course, you see, a lot of soap powders and toothpaste were made from animal offal and bones, you see, and it still is. So, of course, what they used to do was sort of boil it up and make whatever they wanted to do, whether it was soap or toothpaste. There was never a lot of toothpaste in the 1700s. They had many teeth, to be honest, but they had all that. And of course, any of the rubbish then would be just literally let run into the Thames.
No wonder.
But I mean, the Thames has changed so much. You've got salmon and goodness knows what coming up there. An interesting thing: when William the Conqueror came over to London in 1066, he actually built the first tower, which eventually went on to be the Tower of London. It was the White Tower, which still exists to this day, and he built that. And of course, the Tower of London was built around it. But then, for several years after that, the Tower of London was almost lost in amongst all the other buildings and the debris and the degradation that went on in those days.
When you go way back in time, you know, if you look at books, and I don't know whether Gilda O'Neill has pictures in the book, does she?
Yes, she has, yeah. There are quite a few pictures, but of course, pictures are relatively new, and they're not going back to the age I've been referring to. But it's interesting. I don't know if any of your listeners have been watching the Sunday night programme Midwife, or Midwives, but they've tried to recreate 1957, and they've done it very well. But of course, it's all so clean. All the actors are clean, the clothes are clean, you know. And having been around then, it wasn't really like that. So, but the pictures do help. But I honestly think, JP, pictures only help if you know what it was really like.
That's right, yes.
You can't imagine. You can look at a picture and say, cool, look at that's a shame. But unless you can, as you say about the soap factory, unless you can recreate and remember the smells and the noises and the sounds and the rag and bone men coming up the street, you know, and things, people sharpening your knives. And
that's right, yeah.
It
takes me way back, that does now.
Yeah.
It's making me feel old, Graham.
Well, you want to read the beginning of the book. It starts at 48 AD, you know, so...
I'm not that old.
No. But I mean, interestingly, there were so many people in the East End. A lot of migrants were there. A lot of Germans. There were a massive amount of Germans and Jewish people, more Germans than anyone. And then the Huguenots came over, and that's my family originate from, or one side of my family, my father's side of the Huguenots. And they owned a lot of the East End, and Dolland, the name Dolland, was a very famous name, which of course went on to be Dolland and Acheson, the opticians. And they were Huguenot, because they used to grow plants, and there was a running joke in those days that, you know, they'd have an area of garden the size of a small carpet. You know, they'd grow things wherever they could. But a lot of the people, because it was really bad in the mid-1800s, thousands and thousands of people were shipped off to Canada because times were so hard, and just left England. So there was a balance ultimately, because then you had the cholera epidemic where tens of thousands died. And another strange thing, that they said that people had to stay in their homes to prevent them catching cholera. But of course, in those days, they had very little food in the houses. So many of those people actually starved to death in their own homes because they couldn't go out.
Well, they didn't have the money to go out with, did they?
No, but they couldn't go and buy. They weren't allowed to go out of the house because of picking up the diseases. They said, you stay where you are. So they had no money to go and buy food to eat, and a lot of them did die, which is almost a paradox, isn't it? But I mean, going forward into the war, I know that the first bombings were the East End, of course, the docks and that area, and that was pretty dramatic, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I remember my father telling me that one of his houses, well, his house actually, not one of his houses, he wasn't that rich, they went out one night and that got bombed. Yeah.
It's quite frightening. I mean, you know, London, I mean, I know, you know, for the first year or so, they evacuated everyone, and then they found that, you know, they realised that, you know, we didn't think that we were going to get bombed. And of course, they all went back again, and then they did get bombed. I think it was about 1941, I think. So all hell let loose then, and they were sent. All the children were sent away down to our part of the world, really.
Yes, that's right. They were put on trains and ferried out, weren't they?
That's right. With a little brown label on them, and there's pictures of that in there. And that's where I think the picture on the front. I mean, it shows these three look like girls, young girls, happy, smiling, been shopping by the looks. So they probably had their not vouchers, I can't think what it was called in those days, but ration books, weren't they? And they've probably been out and bought sweets, or maybe the ration had just finished and they were able to go out and buy sweets. But it's a wonderful book. I think that, in all honesty, anyone who wants to know about London and England and the history, And it's not a heavy thing. It's not heavy on dates and things like that. It's just beautifully written. And I think it's the sort of book that almost anyone and everyone should read. Just if they're interested in England and what we're about and how we got to be where we are today. And I think it's a wonderful read. It is not boring. You can pick it up and put it down. You can read the odd chapters. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of information in here. It must have taken her a long time to write it. And a little caption at the top, a review in a way, and it's 2 words, and it says, "A treasure." And that was the Daily Mail. Now, it is a treasure because it's a book that I don't generally keep the books after I've reviewed them, but this is one book that I will keep. Hopefully one day my grandchildren might get around to reading it because it's got so many facts and wonderful information in there.
That's My East End by Gilda O'Neill. It's from Penguin, I believe, Graham, is it?
It's Penguin Books, and it's $8.99, and again, Waterstones, any of the bookshops, online. And she has written 2 others, and she has won awards, but as I say, unfortunately, she's no longer with us, but she has left something that I think is it is a treasure, and it's something that everyone should have and refer to when they feel a little low, just to see how hard it was for everyone else, you know. Nice to be with you again, JP.
And you, Graham.
And we'll talk next month.
I'll tell you what, Graham, if it's a book about pie and mash, I'll be reading it all the time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Graham, take care.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.